Hey everyone, this is Miss Weaver, and this is our video set for section 10.1. This will be part 1. So in this section, talking about just the language of hypothesis testing, we're going to talk about what is a hypothesis test. We're going to look at how to determine the null and alternative hypotheses based on information given in the word problem. We're going to talk about the different errors we can make. We'll call them a type 1 error and a type 2 error. And of course, that's not very telling in the name, but we'll discuss those. And then we'll talk about the different decisions we can make versus the conclusions that we want to write following that decision. In this particular video, we're going to just talk about what is a hypothesis test. To start off with, the first thing I want to do is talk about the difference between a confidence interval and a hypothesis test. So in both cases, these are what we've been calling inferential statistics. But in a confidence interval, we are trying to estimate an unknown parameter. But in a hypothesis test, what we're doing is we're actually testing a sample to see if it's significantly different. And we will talk about that word significantly more in section 10.2 and section 10.3. But significant just means, enough for us to take notice. That's kind of how we're using it right now. So there's estimating and then there's testing. And when we don't know what that population parameter should be, our confidence interval gave us a range of possible values for that parameter. But with a hypothesis test, we have a known or expected value for our parameter, but we've taken a sample, and for some reason, we either think that that parameter has changed or we think that our sample has come from a different population. So we want to know how it compares. And that's what we're going to be doing in this chapter. All right, so our textbook has a really great definition, or I guess just the big idea of what hypothesis testing is. And so let's talk about that. So the big idea of hypothesis testing is to make an assumption about reality and then collect sample evidence to determine whether or not this contradicts the assumption. So I might have some idea of the heights of young women between the ages of 18 and 24. And if I feel that, historically, I have an average height or a mean height for that group, but I think that it's different in a certain region, or that it's different in for a certain group of people, then I can run a hypothesis test to collect that sample data, collect that evidence, and then I can use that to tell whether or not my assumption is true. So this is what we've been building up to the entire semester. So in chapter 1, we talked about sampling, and we need to make sure that we are sampling properly. And we talked about experimental design. And remember, if data are not collected properly, then they could be so completely useless that there's nothing we can do with them. So we want to make sure we sample properly And if we're doing an experiment, we want to make sure that we do a randomized experiment with controls and everything else. In chapter 2 and 3, we talked about summarizing our data. And we're going to use those data summaries, the graphs we're going to use, like we've been using, to tell whether or not our sample has any outliers. So we might look at a modified box plot. We will look at the histogram to see if it's approximately normal. We'll look at the mean and the standard deviation and the sample proportion. And we'll look at all of these different things that we've talked about early on in descriptive statistics so that we can use them to then infer something about our population. And then, of course, in chapter 5, we discussed the idea of probability and something being unusual. So up until now, we've basically said something is unusual if the probability of that event is less than 5% or less than 0.05. We're actually going to be using this idea, but we're going to be allowed to change that value depending on what we're testing, what our hypothesis test is going to mean. And we'll talk about how and why we might change that value. And then in chapters 6 through 8, that's kind of our bridge between how we get from probability, or how we use probability, to make reliable decisions. So that probability gives us reliability. So just like our confidence interval, we were 95% confident about that confidence interval that we found. That's a measure of reliability. We're going to have a similar, it's actually the complement of that confidence level. We're going to have a similar term called our significance level. And if we are below that significance level, then that tells us how reliable our results are. Okay, our textbook identifies 3 steps in hypothesis testing. And our first step is to make a statement regarding the nature of the population. This is going to be our claim. What are we claiming to be true? Our next step is to collect evidence. This is going to be our sample data to test the statement. So we need to find evidence that would help us to make sure we know whether or not we have something significant. And then our last step is to analyze the data and assess the likelihood of that statement. And we'll see what these things mean as we go through an example. But here are 3 steps for hypothesis testing.